welcome to Voices of the West from Dusty Saddle. Today we are honored with, I don't even know where to start on all of this. This is a man who basically lives my dream for life on everything, but Howard Weinstein. He is author of 2 Western books as well as enormous numbers, well, at least 60 Star Trek comics, 9 novels, and enormous other things. He's been working on V, been working on a bunch of things. Howard, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Kevin.
So tell us a little here about yourself and how you got started in writing.
Well, I kind of knew I wanted to be a writer when I was in junior high school. And the show that got me interested in wanting to write was Star Trek. I was a huge Star Trek fan, original. I was 12 when the show came on. And by the time I kind of got around to saying, you know what, I really would love to write for this, there wasn't any more Star Trek to write for because the show had been canceled. So when they did the animated Star Trek series on NBC on Saturday mornings back in 1973, I watched it and I said, this is good. It wasn't a kid show. It was up to the levels of the original show. People who had written for the original show were writing for the animated version. And so I basically broke most of the rules by writing a spec script and sending it to a studio in California. And I was fortunate that the timing was right, the script was good enough, and they bought the script. So I was 19, I was a college junior at the University of Connecticut. And so by the age of 19, I had kind of achieved what I thought was my dream, which was to be a professional writer. I learned very quickly over the next several years that it's never that easy, and had my share of comeuppance in terms of any more success. And then I eventually went into writing Star Trek novels in the late 70s when Simon and Schuster took over the license. And I had never really thought about writing novels. I really wanted to be a screenwriter, but it seemed like the only way at that point to tell other Star Trek stories. And so I sold the first novel that I submitted to Simon and Schuster. They bought it, and it came out in 1981. And that's how I became a novelist. And then most of the next 4 decades writing mostly Star Trek, some other things. And then I kind of shifted gears, and I remembered how much I loved Westerns when I was a kid growing up. I hadn't watched too many of them in the ensuing years, but one of my top 5 favorite movies, and I try to watch it every few years, is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And that kind of became my inspiration for discovering the Encore Western cable channel. And they showed old movies and old reruns of TV series, some of which I remembered when I was a kid, mainly Maverick and Have Gun Will Travel. And I started recording and watching those again. And they hold up surprisingly well for shows that were done 60 years ago. And my memories were hazy. I didn't really remember specific stories. So for me, it was like watching these 2 shows for the first time. And I got this idea in my head. One of the flaws of early television, 50s and 60s, was that there wasn't a lot of character development or a lot of continuity. And I thought it would be really fun to do a sort of origin story Maverick novel about Bart and Brett Maverick when they were kids and how they became the guys that we knew from the TV series. And it took me about 5 months to get hold of somebody at Warner Brothers who could give me permission or not. And their answer was very succinct: no. So I couldn't get the rights to do it even on their approval, purely on spec. And by then I had done enough research into the time period and sort of developing the characters that I decided, why waste the work that I had done? So I again changed gears, and instead of doing a Maverick novel, it became my own original Galloway's Gamble with my own characters, which obviously gives you a lot more freedom. Having never written a Western or historical fiction before, one of the first things that I learned was that science fiction has to be plausible, but historical fiction has to be accurate.
Mhm.
And if it's not accurate, somebody's going to catch you. Somebody knows more than you do. So that kind of got me to that point. So I'll shut up now and let you ask a
Oh
question.
no, definitely the interview is you. So, well, I mean, you got your first Western you came out with there for Galloway's Gamble, and you managed to get a Western Fictioneers Award out of it. So that's pretty good out of the gate for everything.
Yeah, that was a very pleasant surprise. I don't know what the standards were, but hey, if somebody wants to give me an award, I will take it.
Absolutely, and certainly helps market the book as it goes that way too.
Yeah.
So you put Galloway's Gamble together as basically, well, it's yeah, there it is. An origin story for the Maverick series, but I assume you split it off quite a bit from there after once you said they said no to the rights on everything. What tell us a little bit more about it? Because I personally love the gambler whole motif that goes into westerns, and people don't write it very often.
Yeah, one of the things that I did was, for those of our viewers who remember Maverick, remember there were always as my old pappy used to say, and obviously a big change was now it became what Mama used to say. So I had to create a whole family background for these characters. There was so little in the Maverick series that I really was going to have to cook up almost everything from scratch. But with my own series, it didn't matter anymore what I was launching off from. So the freedom to essentially make up a whole family history, where they were born, what their mother was like, why their mother ended up killing their father, who was an abusive drunk, and ended up running the saloon that their father had been running poorly. And their mother, Kara, really wants to do this as a business. And one of the things that I found in my research, we tend to think from old Western movies and TV series that women were not all that important in the West, but there were plenty of women who managed to succeed on their own, sort of on their own 2 feet, who were not always subservient to men. And because this is one of the things that where you do the research and you go, okay, I'm allowed to do this because I know that there were people who actually did this sort of thing in real life. Well, doing research to me was great fun. I've always been interested in history anyway, but now I was doing specific research into a specific time period, specific locales, and there's really kind of two kinds of research that you would do for this kind of book. One is you're looking for specific information. For instance, I needed to know by what date in history could you have taken a train all the way from St. Louis into Texas? And I couldn't find an exact date. I was finding a range and I was ready to fudge it. And I looked one more time. You know what this is like? It's like those of us who are old enough to remember the Yellow Pages phone book before everybody just looked on the internet for whatever they needed to find. Well, if you didn't know the right category name when you open the Yellow Pages, you'd never find the information you were looking for. And Google, of course, is very much the same way. You keep changing the wording in your Google search, and you get a whole different set of results. So I must have found the magic formula, and I found the exact specific date that I needed. And it happened to be perfect for what I had intended in the story. So I breathed a sigh of relief and I used the real date. But the other kind of research that you do is just generally kind of absorbing information to give you a feel for the time period, the locale, what life was like. And you never really know when you're going to find something that is so perfect for your story. And the fact that it really happened makes it even more perfect. One of the things that I discovered early on, do you remember the old Time Life series of books they used to do in the 60s, mostly in the 60s, into the 70s? They did these huge, beautifully bound sets of books, big format. I have one right here, in fact. So this one is called The Indians, but there were I think 16 different books they did on the Old West. And these were great. They were put together by very careful editors. The writing was good. Plus, Time Life was notorious, or rather noted, I should say, for their use of photographs and images. And so they went through the historical record for me. I didn't have to go to all of the original source material. I used what they had kind of winnowed out and put in here. And one of the things about research of history is they're not really discovering troves of new photographs from the 1860s anymore. Pretty much everything that's out there is already archived. And so are the facts. So when I was reading these books, I basically approached it like a school project where I just took notes. I would read and take notes and read and take notes. And one of the stories that I ran across was a story about a gambler who was down on his luck and pretty much out of money. And gamblers, those of us, again, who know the history and what people dressed like, pretty much everybody wore black frock coats. And whether you were the doctor or the undertaker or the gambler or the preacher, the clothing wasn't that different. So this gambler went to a saloon in the town he was in. I think it may have been in Dodge City. And he pretended he was a preacher. And he asked if he could preach a sermon that night at the saloon. And the proprietor thought this would be pretty amusing. So he said, sure. So that evening he came in. The gambler pretended, again, put on the whole preacher act. He preached the sermon, passed the hat around. The gamblers were entertained by this. It was a break from gambling. And he passed the hat and he collected enough money and he left town and he started gambling again. And I went, I could not have made that up. The fact that this is historical and is factual, I went, this is perfect. So research is really fun because you never quite know what you're going to run across. In a similar vein, I wasn't researching horse racing for the first book, for Galloway's Gamble, but I found a couple of interesting facts. One was in the mid 1880s, I think it was 1886, there was a horseman in California named James Ben Ali Haggin. And he had a horse that he believed could win the Kentucky Derby. But he was going to travel 2,000 miles from California to Kentucky. And no one would know his horse. And the fact that the horse had just traveled 2,000 miles by train probably would make people think the horse was not in the best of condition. But he was sure he could win. And he also figured he could clean up on the betting because his horse was a long shot, a complete unknown long shot. And when he arrived, the track management raised the fee that they charged the bookmakers for being able to do betting business on the premises of Churchill Downs. And they tripled the rate that the bookmakers, now I didn't know anything about how betting worked in that time period, but as I was reading this, okay, so the bookies went on strike. And James Haggin was furious, but he was even more furious because he couldn't bet. And his horse won the race and he didn't make any money on the betting. And he swore that he would never go back to Kentucky, to Churchill Downs with any other racehorses in the future. And he didn't. He stuck by his guns. And I thought, I would never have known this if I didn't read this little fact. And I thought, this is the germ of a new book. And that became this book, which is the sequel, Galloway's Gamble II, Lucifer and the Great Baltimore Brawl. I also learned that black jockeys were dominant in horse racing both before the Civil War and for the latter part of the 19th century until Jim Crow laws took over and they were basically excluded and drummed out of the sport of horse racing to the point where they had won, black jockeys won, I think it was 13 of the first 15 Kentucky Derby races. And then there were no black jockeys for most of the 20th century. So that was something that I wanted to know about because I'm sort of straddling the period before and after the Civil War. And I touched on that a lot in the first book. The second book is more focused. It takes place in 1873, whereas the first book stretched from the early 1820s up to the 1870s. And so when you're trying to work in things like, well, what was it like to be a black jockey after the Civil War? And how did they become so dominant? The answer to that was horse racing really got its start in the South for the most part. And slaves took care of the horses, they trained the horses, and they became jockeys. And while they were still slaves, some of them actually had lives that were a little more expansive than a typical slave would have had, because they were even allowed to keep some of their winnings, and they were given certain privileges, but you were still a slave. So there was always that hanging over your head. Even if you were a successful black jockey at that time, you were still an enslaved person. So finding all these little tidbits, if you're lucky, you find the tidbits that give you the energy that drives the story. And I was fortunate in that I found out enough about horse racing. One of my favorite tidbits was back in the days before photography and video, if it was a foggy race, it was not unheard of for a horse to cut across the infield and end up running half the race, which made that horse pretty energetic toward the end of the race. So finding little things like that that are real, that actually happened, give the story that sense of reality. And it just makes you feel good about the story you're writing to know those things.
Yeah, that's a depth of potential story writing coming out of reality that you couldn't even dream about. That's very fascinating things there. Now, you did a thing with, in the first book, you started out basically looks like from New Orleans and you take them to San Francisco. Then the second book, you take them from San Francisco back to Baltimore.
Yes.
As it goes on, everything there. And you are based there in Maryland as well. Do you have a little bit of tribute to the hometown kind of thing going with this?
Yes. One of the things I thought about when I was trying to get any coverage for the first book, I live in the Mid-Atlantic. I'm a transplanted New Yorker, and I've lived here for 30 plus years now. And Baltimore is an interesting town. It has an interesting, colorful history. But I thought if I write another book in this series and some of it takes place in Baltimore, maybe I can get a little more Mid-Atlantic coverage from the local media. I don't know. I'm going to find out soon enough. The book just came out. But I did definitely want to work in actual things about Baltimore. When I first moved here years ago, I discovered there was an area in Baltimore called Pigtown. And when I found out why it was called Pigtown, the answer to that was back when the railroad was a primary means of even before the transcontinental railroad, there were eastern to midwestern railroads that ran from the East Coast to places like Ohio and Chicago. The rest of the country was still left out of that, but the area where the freight station in Baltimore was located, right around that, there developed a sort of little district of slaughterhouses and meatpacking places, because the pigs would come in from the Midwest on the train, and then these herds of pigs would be walked across town to where they would be kept penned up until they were slaughtered. And so the area still is called Pigtown. And I thought, okay, that's just a great name. I'm going to use that in a story someday. And this book gave me the opportunity to do that. The Pimlico racetrack, which is where the Preakness has been held for most of the last 140 or 50 years or so, it opened in 1870. And it was brand new. So my story, this second story, Lucifer and the Great Baltimore Brawl, takes place in 1873. So I learned more about Pimlico history and how the track came to be built. And just again, it's just kind of working this stuff in, finding out what neighborhoods there were in Baltimore in that time period. One of the best things that I stumbled across is back in the 1800s, especially latter half of the 1800s. In order to promote commercial development in various towns and cities, the city fathers would often commission what, for lack of a better term, are bird's eye view maps of their town or city. And you may have seen these if you read history or read a magazine like True West magazine. You'll often see they're street maps, but they're done, it's hard to even describe. It's as if you're in a balloon looking down on the town. So it's almost
view up kind of.
Exactly. So it's almost three-dimensional. And they have all of the buildings there. And in the ones that were really detailed, they would also have a sort of legend on the bottom of the map, which would tell you by number what certain buildings were. So it's as close as you can get to time traveling and literally being able to walk through a city. And I didn't even know these maps existed. And when I found out that they existed, I started finding them. A lot of them are Library of Congress images that you can access, and you can blow them up. One week rather, I went to my dentist as I was doing this book and doing the research. And I know everyone who worked in my dentist's office here in Baltimore pretty much grew up in the area. And so I went to their computer and I said, I got to show you guys what I found. And one of the staff members had just bought an old house, a pre-Civil War house. So we found where it was located. So she got to see on this sort of almost 3D map of 1870s Baltimore what the area around her house looked like when the house was first built. So stuff like that is really fun because it does help you put yourself on the street as close as you can literally get without having a time portal that takes you back. So finding things like that is really fun because it makes the imagination of the experience, and then putting it down on paper in words where a reader can get into that imagination, it just makes it more accurate and it makes it feel more real.
Absolutely. And also, if your time period of all this, you're kicking into the beginning of the Triple Crown of all of this as well, aren't you?
That started somewhere in the 1870s. So my story is a little before that. One of the other things that I found was in 1877, there was a big match race. Sort of the passions of the Civil War had been channeled into horse racing. And so there were Northern horses, Kentucky horses, and Southern horses. So it was the four best horses of 1877. And this match race was at Pimlico in Baltimore. And horse racing turned out was the first national sport. It coincided with the Transcontinental Railroad, so people could travel, and it also coincided with telegraph communications. So suddenly, race results could be transmitted around the country within minutes. And so people who did not live in certain areas could follow racing in those areas because the newspapers of the time and the specialist sports, actually, there were sports newspapers as well. They would print these, the results, and you would learn almost like we do from watching sports on TV, ESPN, you know, the wrap-ups of the weekend's games or whatever. People would actually follow the careers of certain jockeys, and that's how so many black jockeys became nationally famous. So this 1877 match race was such a big deal all over the country, but especially here in the Mid-Atlantic. Congress in Washington shut down for the day. The Senate and the House closed down because all the representatives and senators wanted to hop on the train from Washington and take the train up to Baltimore so they could go to this race. There were rumors that President Grant was going to take a special presidential train up there. I don't remember whether he actually did that. In my story, he does. But I took this idea of this fantastic match race and I just moved it back a few years and fictionalized it. But I was able to find a book that was just about this match race and pretty much got a good feel for what it was like. So I used details from the real race, which took place 4 years after my race did, and just moved them back into the fictionalized version. But getting a sense from first person observations, primary source writing about the real race gave me details I could steal. And if I can find something I can steal and use it, man, I'm happy to do that. If somebody has already done the work for me, I'm happy to accept that gift.
Absolutely. Saves an enormous amount of effort on your part. So you've got two down here that you've got in the worlds of Westerns. What's next on the plate?
Well, I have two more stories that I'd like to write with these characters. When I sold the first book, I only submitted it to one publisher. there are not, as you guys know, there are not that many publishers doing Western slash historical fiction anymore. And it's a very niche kind of market, but it does have a substantial number of loyal readers. And one of the publishers that I found was a publisher called Five Star Publishing. And they'd been in business for about 25 years. They were a little tiny imprint at a huge company called Gale Cengage. And their specialty was Western pioneer, frontier historical fiction. And they loved the first book, Galloway's Gamble, and they bought it right away. And then when the first book came out, the editors, who were wonderful people to work with, every writer who ever worked with Five Star loved working with them. They really respected the writers. They actually paid in advance, which was nice. A lot of publishers don't do that anymore. And they said to me, do you have any more stories with these characters? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. So I had kind of conceived of the second book was going to be about horse racing. And it was delayed for a number of reasons, which I'm not going to bore people with, but I took much longer to write it than I expected to. So I finally sent it back to Five Star. I kept them apprised why I was being so slow on it. And they were just really great about it. They said, whenever it's done, just let us know. We're looking forward to it. Unfortunately, by the time I sent it to them, their parent company decided that they were shutting them down. So after 27 years, getting great reviews, putting out 48 novels a year, winning awards, they were no longer in existence. And all the writers who worked with them were really heartbroken. We really just were not happy about this. We felt bad for the staff because they were great to work with. And we felt bad for ourselves because they were great to work with. So what a lot of writers are doing now is they're either going to small publishers or we're self-publishing. And so the second book came out from a group called Silverado Press, which is a division of a writers co-op collective called Crazy Eight Press. And I was one of the founders of Crazy Eight Press about a dozen years ago, and then I kind of wandered away. It was mostly science fiction and fantasy, but the people who stuck with it over the years, I and another writer named Jeff Marriott, who some of your viewers may know. Jeff's written a bunch of Westerns and Western comic books and weird Westerns and science fiction and Star Trek and police procedurals. And Jeff and I have known each other since I worked with him on some Star Trek comic projects about 20 years ago when he was an editor at Wildstorm Comics. So we approached Crazy Eight Press and we said, how about you guys want to branch out into historical fiction? And they said, yeah, actually, we're thinking about it. So we established Silverado Press. Jeff has a book out, an anthology called Bird's Luck and Other Western Stories, which is very good. And it's half sort of traditional Westerns and half weird Westerns. So it's 10 stories total. And so Jeff and I are, we're going to kind of work with Crazy Eight and maybe bring in some other writers who want to do this kind of story. And we'll see what happens. It's tough. The hardest part is promotion and marketing. Not that writing is easy, but compared to promotion and marketing, writing is easy. And most writers are kind of introverts, and we're not real good about, marketing ourselves and promoting ourselves. But it's a skill that we kind of have to learn how to do better if we're going to make it. And
Current market
Kickstarter
kind
is
of
another
made
way.
that, but you have better chances of doing it now than you've ever had before,
Yeah.
too. So that's
Yeah.
a plus in that.
So yes, 2 more stories I'm hoping to get done. The next one, what I did in the first book is I planted the seed of what the second book would be. And then I like that idea. And so in the second book, I've planted the idea of what the third book will be. And it's going to be more Western. The second book, Lucifer and the Great Baltimore Brawl, kind of splits from San Francisco about half and half. First half of the stories in San Francisco, second half of the stories in Baltimore. And the third book will be more Western. I discovered, again, doing research, just kind of looking at stuff that looks interesting. In the 1860s, there was a bone war. What I mean by that is paleontology was just getting started as a science. And there were two paleontologists who had started out as mentor and student, and then became friends, and then became frenemies, and then became enemies. Their names were Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Marsh. And Marsh was a big deal at Yale University. Well, yeah, I don't know, if it was a university or still a college at that point, but he worked at Yale. And Cope was part of a Philadelphia scientific establishment. And the two of them, as more and more fossils, dinosaur fossils, were being discovered out in the West, mainly the Badlands in San Francisco, not San Francisco, in North Dakota and Wyoming, and the territories there, just a lot of that central western part of the country. And this was a real competition between them, and it got very cutthroat. And I went, ooh, this is great. One of the nice things about creating Jamey and Jake Galloway, my main characters, my brothers, I call them endearingly argumentative brothers, is that I can put them anywhere in the country during the time period, and they can get involved with other characters who are kind of the focus of the story. And Jake and Jamey, as they get involved, they really get wrapped up in whatever the conflict is. So in the first book, it was a sort of a banker and a rancher, big, huge rancher in Texas, trying to run people out of a town so they could get the land for themselves. In the second book, it's rich horsemen trying to cheat, and how the little guys can kind of try to get back at them. In each story, I'm trying to work a sort of con game into the story, because that's part of the idea of that I kind of picked up from Maverick. And also a lot of humor in the stories, which goes to the feeling you get from Maverick and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and a series that I remember from the early 70s, Alias Smith and Jones. And the third book will have Jake and Jamey getting involved with the Bone Wars, the paleontological wars in the Badlands. So that would be the third book. And the fourth book would kind of be centered around an art theft, which is related to the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And so, yeah, I really hope that I get a chance to write these stories, but they're really fun. They're fun to write, and people are seeming to feel they're fun to read.
Well, they sound very fascinating. I'm looking forward to the other books coming out on all of that.
Thank you.
Where can people learn more about you?
I have a website, howardweinsteinbooks.com, and I was so busy trying to finish the second book that I didn't do anything in updating the website for about 5 years. So I'm doing that now. And and I'm also on one social media outlet, Facebook. I'm just under my name. So if people want to check out what I'm posting or friend me, I'll be happy to friend them back. And that way they can keep up on what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking the time today. It's been an honor to be able to interview you on this, and I'm looking forward to where you're going.
Thanks, Kevin. It was great talking to you. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, my pleasure.